rural. And I think that description of it neatly captures the ways in which definitions of what and who is rural are increasingly now contested and turbulent. And in asking what and who immediately evokes and foregrounds questions around identity. And I think it goes back to a comment that John made on the panel, which was, you know, how on their project they continually found themselves talking about identity because people, how people thought about themselves meant that they had to kind of engage with identity questions. So the collections of essays that are in the book, which all draw on a range of qualitative and quantitative data, are troubled by the nature of the intersecting relationship between morality and ethnicity, which is also a relationship between space and identity. And central to this kind of trouble that we all shared in this book is the place of the rural in narratives of nation. And in England in particular, the rural occupies this dominant place where it stands in as a shorthand representation of what Englishness is. Although the role of the rural in defining national identity is not confined to England, and the book itself looks at other nations, and it looks at Wales and Scotland, and it looks at republicanism in Northern Ireland as well. And the book itself tells two entangled accounts of rurality and the ethnicity relation. And it examines the countryside as this idealised or fantasised space of natural and social appeal, of picturesque landscapes and cosy village-scapes. And it argues that this fantasy is intensified kind of in late modernity's kind of crisis of insecurity and uncertainty, of precariousness and post-colonial anxieties, that the countryside seems to offer a timeless, nostalgic space where community and social order are strong and social problems are absent. But more particularly, it's a racialised space, which is associated heavily with whiteness and with mono and not with multiculture. Now, this dominant imagining of rural spaces has discursive and material outcomes. Perhaps most significantly, this imagining of the rural as a white space writes out, it excludes an idea of a multicultural nation. If you're written out of the countryside, you're written out of the country. More prosaically, incidents of racist attacks in rural areas are high, and accounts of everyday experiences of racism are significant in rural areas. Rural policymakers are uneven in terms of their response to thinking about the relevance of race and multiculture in rural and semi-rural areas. Another example is recreational use of the countryside is low amongst black and minority ethnic groups. And black and minority ethnic rural dwellers, or people who live in those areas or visit them, speak of feelings of isolation and feelings of cultural conditionality, of the imperative to fit in, to become the same. And also, it has meant that the rural has been a site of neglect in terms of race and ethnicity studies, and the scrutiny of race and ethnicity has overwhelmingly been in urban environments. If we think about all those large-scale studies, it's always been Bristol, London, Birmingham, Liverpool, where those studies have taken place. Now, the essays in the book evidence and document and analyse aspects of those social outcomes, and they move from the specific experiences of refugees and New Age travellers and gypsy travellers, and move those experiences and theorise them in ways which moves to broader debates about the construction of spaces and the construction of identities. And in doing so, the book tells another story. It argues that the countryside and rural populations are much more heterogeneously and multiculturally constituted than is popularly imagined. That rural spaces themselves are different and diverse, and like urban spaces are characterised by persistent change. And that persistent change creates spaces for new insertions and new presences. And that pace of change means the distinction, which is often thought of as a hard distinction between the rural and urban, is becoming increasingly indistinct. I think it's important that in terms of thinking about space and identity, that rural spaces in the UK are ones which have never been settled and fixed in this kind of place of tranquility, but have a long history of contestation and struggle that go back to the diggers movement or the Highland clearances or the enclosure movement or mass trespass in the 1930s, to gypsy and New Age traveller presences, of course. So the rural is a site of contestation, and it's a site, and this again makes a link back to the Citizenship and Governance panel, it's a site in which citizenship is enacted. The excluded from the rural do not stay excluded, but continually make claims on it, recognise their entitlement to be in rural spaces, and have attachments to the rural as well. And I think that we, as editors, we saw that was a key task of the book, to evidence some of those struggles and contestations and some of that change and unsettledness of rural spaces. So the book's about revealing, if you like, a more unruly rural story and challenging the fantasy, the white fantasy of the rural. And in doing that, in making that challenge, I think we're progressing the idea that you cannot look at identity as singular, nor can you look at it as spatially unconnected. The identity is plurally constituted and is spatially shaped. And so just to finish then, to return to the challenge that Anne outlined from Stuart Hall, I think in moving the specifics of the book talk about personal and micro experiences and accounts. And it moves from the local to the larger scale social world. Because I think at the heart of this book, and what we've tried to do in getting this collection of authors together, is argue for a more broken narrative, if you like, of rurality, as a way of reimagining, and again this goes back to what Anne was saying, reimagining a multicultural society's national story.
I'm Kath Woodward in sociology here at the OU, and thank heavens I don't actually do professional boxing because I wouldn't be able to stand the lights. My book is, I'll say a bit about the book and how it fits into the questions and the issues that Anne posed. It is about boxing, but it's more about identities and identifications, and in particular masculinity. But I chose boxing because it's a very troubling kind of place. It's troubling because somebody asked a question about where was the unsavoury. Well, that's one place where the unsavoury is, I suppose, in boxing. You know, it's kind of troubling in the 21st century that people are still, well, not just being paid to knock hell out of each other, but, you know, other people are paying a lot of money to watch them doing it. And I speak not as an insider in that I don't do it, but I do watch it. So I'm not entirely blameless in this enterprise. But I think there is a big issue around, you know, something that seems to be so troubling, and that's why it's interesting, because identities are troubling and identifications are troubling. And yet, on the one hand, it's very much about a proliferation of difference. You know, whereas Sarah's saying that the countryside has been encoded white, well, boxing has been encoded by the disadvantaged and the excluded. It's always been about mobility and about multi-ethnicity and about a place where those who are socially excluded seek to achieve something of the dreams that they have, and it's being included in a particular world. That's one aspect of its multifaceted interest, anyway, and that's why I think it provides a very interesting space to look at identities, because they are so overtly contradictory. The other aspect of boxing, which I think relates to some of the things that were said in the discussion of citizenship too, is the way in which there's a mismatch between, well, it was meant, I think John mentioned in talking about citizenship, between government and the recipients of, you know, of healthcare, of welfare, that they don't see themselves as citizens.